kind of looks the way the title was up there before with a colon after Uncle Bud, that he was a Titan and a general, and he was neither one of those. But sometimes the question comes up, how do you know what to preach? Do you ever run out of stuff to preach? And just want to talk a little bit about that. Before I get started tonight, Joe just had a blow-you-away sermon this morning. He's a very good preacher. And, of course, one of the things you got to remember is he's a visitor here. He said he travels, 30 or 35 weeks a year. He probably preaches that sermon 30 or 35 weeks. I don't know. And we're not all the same. You know, some people like some preachers better than others. And, for example, Jan likes Mike's preaching better than mine, which is okay because Amanda likes my preaching better than Mike's. It all works out in the wash. I like one of the sayings that a preaching friend of mine has: lighthouses don't compete. And we always need to remember, Joe made this so plain this morning, we're here to preach Jesus Christ and to glorify Him, and He is the message. So how do I decide what to preach? I have some different methods, but I wanted to just kind of present you with some of them tonight because I want you to learn how to practice things like this if it doesn't come natural to you. And I'm going to talk about some one thing that was real important to me last week. Of course, I was out in Ashland, Ohio, and I preached my Uncle Bud's funeral service. And I really counted it an honor. I'm going to tell you a little bit about him tonight and what made him just a real special man and a real special Christian. And the Titan, have any of you seen that in the news? A little submarine that went down, at least probably got close to the Titanic. And I'm going to talk about the general. Does anybody know what general I'm talking about? Other than Wayne Brocious, he knows.
I don't even know.
The commercial?
No, it's not a commercial. I called and requested a song. If you don't ever listen to Wayne on Saturday mornings, you ought to, from 7 o'clock until noon. He has a great radio show, and I called and requested a special song yesterday, and he played it and gave all kinds of information about the general that he doesn't remember now. So we'll refresh your memory. Yes. Uncle Bud was really good to us kids, and I want to talk to you a little bit about that. This is kind of one of the methods that I use. Another method I use probably more often is I go through the daily Bible readings and just take a message from that. Always got something to preach about that's worthy of being preached about. We're going to talk a little bit about the Ocean Gate Titan tonight, and I want to look at two things from that. First of all, what is it like to be trapped? I don't even want to think about what that would have been like for me. That would have been horrible. And the other thing I want to look at is what made it so newsworthy. It seemed like when you turn the TV on or listen to the radio, we got an update, and you're listening for the update. We don't have anything new yet. Okay. And our next update will be in half an hour, and it was, and the update was, we don't have anything to report yet. We're still looking. Third thing I want to look at, and this is the reason I talked about this a little bit, today is the 147th anniversary of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, sometimes known as Custer's Last Stand. And so we're going to talk about that. It happened in 1876. And on this day, June 25th and 26th. And we're going to tie in some lessons. What I want to do is show you how I read things like this, I think about things like this, I see things like this, and I think it's always important for us to relate to spiritual truths. Where do we see God? Where do we see God's hand? My Uncle Bud lived with us for a while. He was 10 years old when my grandpa died. That was several years before I was born. And when Grandpa died, Grandma she had 2 kids out of the house, still had 5 at home, and on a farm, and it was difficult. It was a hard life. And so when my dad married my mother after World War II, they moved in with Grandma, and Dad eventually bought the farm from her. I don't mean that he died. I mean he purchased the farm from her. He didn't buy the farm. But that's where I lived. My grandma lived with us, and Uncle Bud, after he got out of the military, he was a paratrooper. And after he got out of the military, he came back and lived with us for a while, and I loved him, and I knew that. I just didn't know how good he was to us. He took us a lot of places, and for an example, I remember that he was on a bowling league, and his bowling team went down from Ashland, Ohio to Dayton, Ohio, probably a good 2-hour drive, maybe farther, and he took me along. And I'm there, this little kid, in the front seat between 2 big guys, or 3 big guys in the back seat, and people don't. A guy in his 20s isn't going to drag his little nephew down to a bowling tournament, but he did. He took me, my brother Dan, and my sister, when we were still really young, to the drive-in theater, which would have been in 1959. That's when the movie Ben-Hur came out. And he took us to see Ben-Hur. Nobody drags a bunch of raggedy kids around unless they really love them. And he did, and people don't do that, and he always did things like that. He spent a lot of really good time with us. He invested himself in us, and he made a difference in our lives, and I related, of course, a whole lot of things like that when I preached his funeral sermon, and found out from a lot of other people he was like that with his kids, he was like that with his grandchildren, and my Aunt Carolyn, who's one of my mother's 2 surviving siblings yet, said, "Oh, I remember, Bud, when your mom started having you kids." Mom had 6 of us. When she started having you kids, Uncle Bud said, "Oh, she's got these beautiful babies. I just can't wait until we have some." And he loved children. Last week was just a marvelous week in this church, and I really commend this church and the people that did so much for day camp, and it's a lot of work. I know it's a lot of work, and it's a lot of expense, and it's just a lot of kids running around being kids, loud and messy, like we were when we were kids. And kind of like the kids that Jesus welcomed. There were different times when the disciples came to Jesus and they asked him, "Who's the greatest in the kingdom?" They argued about it. One time they were arguing about it on the road. They're traveling. And Jesus knew it. They didn't think he knew. Of course he knew what they were talking about. And so he says, "What were you talking about on the road?" "Oh, nothing." And so he teaches them about who's the greatest in the kingdom. Sometimes Jesus, if I may kind of paraphrase this, the disciples understood how busy Jesus was and how important his work was. And so when people brought their children to him, the disciples kind of shooed him away. He doesn't have time for a bunch of kids hanging around. He's got important things to do. And here's my loose paraphrase. Jesus said, if I don't have time for the adults and the adults can leave. Bring the kids over here. That time the disciples came to Jesus and asked, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? He called a little child and had him stand among them. And he said, I tell you the truth, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever welcomes a little child like this in my name welcomes me. I kind of, it's a little bit of a distance out to Ashland, and so I'm driving out there. Things kind of come together in my mind, and I thought, this is the factor that made Uncle Bud so much like Jesus. And it was natural. I don't remember anybody ever saying, Bud, take Johnny with you. He would just say, Johnny, come on, let's go. He took me to my first roller coaster ride ever, about scared me to death. Took me to see a movie called Gorgo. And I was still pretty young, and he didn't see things like that back then, Tom. They just didn't make a bunch of movies like that. But Gorgo is this giant lizard that comes up out of the ocean, and it was wonderful for a little boy. He had a man in his teeth, and he's shaking him around, and then they got him all penned up and everything, and he couldn't get out. And his mother comes up out of the ocean. She's 3 times as big as Gorgo is. She comes in and rescues him and rips the town into pieces. And I remember things like that. I remember Uncle Bud taking me to things like that. Probably doesn't come as natural as that to any of us, or not very many of us. It's a love that we need to develop. And again, I commend this church. Trapped in the Titan. That is a picture of what the inside of the Titan looked like. There wasn't any way out. It was dark. It was cold. Didn't have any windows. Do you see the seats in there? There weren't any. They had to sit cross-legged on the floor. 5 men in that thing. 1 bathroom. I don't even want to tell you what it was like. It wasn't pleasant. They didn't go down here because it was a nice place to go. And tickets were kind of expensive. $250,000 each. You can go see Taylor Swift for that. The size of this is about the size of the inside of a minivan. Not very big. There was 1 porthole, and they don't know exactly what happened. They think that it was an implosion, and the pressure, and some think it was at the porthole, that it just couldn't take the pressure, and it imploded, and everything was so fast that they were gone in an instant. And I don't mean just dead, I mean disintegrated in an instant. Don't think any of them are worried about the money they lost now. What an awful thing. My dad fought in World War II. It wasn't nice. He never said a whole lot about it. He and Mom would every once in a while, tongue in cheek, joke about his all expenses paid European vacation. It wasn't. When he left, he was 5'8" and weighed 138 pounds, a farm kid from north central Ohio. We never hunted. I almost felt like I was going to get attacked out here when I moved out here because people, do you hunt? No. And I know my mom had told me different times that Dad never wanted to hunt after the war. And I at least got the impression, I think she might have told me this, that he just saw too much killing and just didn't want it anymore. And fortunately, I talked to him one day about it. This is after my mother had passed away. And he told me that one night they were in a foxhole, he and two of his friends, they were his closest friends that night at least, and they got trapped. And he said we got cut off from our company, and Nazi soldiers were walking back and forth and around this foxhole, never saw them all night. One of the guys in the foxhole got shot and killed by a stray bullet. And he told me that after that, he says, I could never trap an animal like that. Now, this isn't anything to do with anybody here hunting. It's just the way my dad felt. Awful to be trapped. Sin is a lot worse trap than that. It's a lot worse trap than the Titan, where they had no chance of getting out if that thing would have floated, which it didn't. But if it would have come up on the surface and floated, they couldn't get out. There's no escape hatch. When they got in, there was a round plate that they put on, that was the door, 18 bolts around it. They bolted them in. This is a little bit weird. There were 18 bolts and they only bolted 17 of them. I don't know why. But they couldn't get out. Paul writes to Timothy and he closes his first letter with this. But godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. People who want to get rich fall into temptation and trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Paul calls this falling into temptation a trap. You get in far enough, you're not going to get out. Proverbs 29:25 says, fear of man will prove to be a snare. But whoever trusts in the Lord is kept safe. And if we get in this dark world, the idea that men are going to direct our lives, I think like Paul talks about the important men in the book of Galatians. He says, what they seemed to be didn't mean anything to me. Just water off a duck's back. Sin's a dark, cold, miserable place, and it leads to death. Don't get in the trap. How many of you have ever seen a picture of this boat? Please raise your hand if you have. I'm not too surprised. It was in the news, but it was just barely in the news, and you had to kind of know about it and look it up, and I did. This underwater vessel, the Ocean Gate Titan, dominated the news for several days. There were 5 people in that. They paid $250,000 apiece to get in it. Which people are more important? On the left, these are migrants in a vessel crossing the Mediterranean Sea. They were traveling from Libya to Italy. They were leaving Libya because of war and persecution, and a lot of Christian persecution. If you haven't read much about that, it's bad and it's getting worse. Terrorists are killing Christians and they're gaining ground. Some unscrupulous individuals got what they could out of people that were the migrants, anywhere from $750 to $3,500. Crowded them on these boats, and they were crossing the Mediterranean Sea at about the same time that the Ocean Gate Titan was in the news all the time. This sank. Why didn't we hear about it? And why did we nothing but hear about the other? What's the difference? Here's what we don't hear about. These are refugees typically from Libya to Italy, and this is just this year. People that get crowded on boats similar to the one that I showed the picture of. February 14th, Valentine's Day, 18 people were dead and 55 missing. February 26th, another boat sank, at least 94 people dead. March 26th, at least 29 migrants dead. April 24th, at least 70 dead. If it was in the news, I didn't hear it. June 14th. Another one we didn't hear in the news, maybe just a little spot here and there. At least 79 people dead at the same time that 5 people died. Seems a little out of balance. Money makes the difference. That's what it is. But not with God. Isaiah 61, he says, "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners." In Matthew chapter 11, John the Baptist sent a couple of his disciples to ask Jesus, "Are you the expected one, or should we wait for someone else?" And Jesus didn't say yes or no. He quoted this because it's about him. He said, "You go back and tell this to John," because I'm sure John the Baptist preached this at the Jordan. Galatians 2. James, Peter, and John, those reputed to be pillars, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship when they recognized the grace given to me. They agreed that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the Jews. All they asked was that we should continue to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. It seems like God is kind of concerned about money, but concerned that we don't chase after it, that it doesn't become so important, and that we get caught up in that trap, and that we remember the poor. James 1, what does God call pure and undefiled religion? to care for the fatherless and the widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. Jesus teaches so many times, do for other people without expecting back. The Gentiles expect back. The general and General Custer, George Armstrong Custer, was made a general in the Civil War. He was 23 years old, and he was not the youngest general that there ever was, but he's pretty close. He was actually a captain in the regular army and promoted to lieutenant colonel in charge of the 7th Cavalry, and that's the cavalry division that was in the Battle of Little Bighorn. 147 years ago today. Some anniversaries aren't as good as others. This is a picture or painting of Custer's last stand by Charles Marion Russell. The lesson I would learn from that is, don't underestimate your opponent. There were 3 different nations of Indians who came together. This is not it's in the southern part of Montana, just north of Wyoming, the Wyoming border. And the reason that this whole battle took place is because somebody found gold out there. And it was an Indian reservation, and General Custer was sent out there to get the Indians off the reservation or give them a smaller reservation so we could get the gold. In this village, there were 7,000 or 8,000 people. That's probably pretty close to twice the population of Brookville. That's a lot of people when you got 700 in the 7th Cavalry that are coming out to do battle with them. The soldiers, General Custer's soldiers, had mostly single-shot rifles. The Indians had a lot of repeating rifles. Massacred the soldiers, didn't kill all of them. They got General Custer and most of them. Don't underestimate your opponent. We dare not underestimate Satan. In 2 Corinthians, the second letter that Paul writes, the first letter he writes, he talks about a disciplinary problem that they had. He says you need to take care of this. And as we read this letter, 2 Corinthians, evidently was resolved some way or another. He doesn't go into great detail, but here's what he says about it. If anyone has caused grief, he has not so much grieved me as he has grieved all of you to some extent. Not to put it too severely, the punishment inflicted on him by the majority is sufficient for him. Now instead, you ought to forgive and comfort him so that he will not be overwhelmed to excessive sorrow. I urge you then, reaffirm your love for him. The reason I wrote you was to see if you would stand the test and be obedient in everything. If you forgive anyone, I also forgive him. And what I have forgiven, if there is anything to forgive, I have forgiven in the sight of Christ for your sake, in order that Satan might not outwit us. For we're not aware of his schemes. And this scheme that Paul talks about is someone in the church who had an egregious sin. They needed to confront him. They took pride in that. They needed to confront him, get it resolved, and then forgiveness takes place. And show him your love and comfort him. Because Satan wants us to hold grudges. Don't let him outwit you. Don't underestimate your opponent. And remember, God is love. That's 3 examples of what I was going to preach on today. But I don't preach every sermon anymore, so I don't do that. I just think about them and preach to myself, I guess. I want to encourage you to learn to do things like that, to think spiritual lessons about things that happen every day. And so I'm going to tell you about a couple of things that happened just yesterday to me. And spiritual lessons. Kind of give you an idea of how my mind operates, at least.
Hey, John,
Yes.
I just want to let you know, I preach to myself in the shower almost every day.
I really
So you're
didn't
not
even
alone.
think about that, Corey.
Well, it's my alone time.
Well, that's good. Someday you can preach to us, but not, dress yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
Dress before you address us. I was in the grocery store, and kind of a fish out of water there. I'm a husband. I could stand there and look at something and wonder where it is. It's just the way we operate. And so I'm walking in the store kind of like this, and I hear, "Red light! Red light!" I looked around, there's a little kid running up the hallway there, and "Red light!" It was his mother. And his father was there too. He says, "Get back here." She looks at the father. "I said red light. That means he's supposed to stop where he is." "Well, I wanted him to come back." "That's part of the problem in this marriage. We never agree on anything." I just looked at the grapes for a while. I had nothing better to do. And of course, the kid is just running around in circles. This obviously is something that happens all the time and means nothing to him. It's a game. I walked on past the grapes. I got up past the crackers. "Red light!" I stopped. And I got over in front of the milk cooler. "Red light!" And of course, he's running all over the place. And I stopped right there in front of the milk cooler. I said, "Lord, thank you for giving me the parents you gave me. They weren't perfect, but they were good and they were godly people, and I thank you for that, Lord." Got my groceries. Yes, I heard red light several more times. It didn't make any difference where you were in the store. Got out to my van, got the groceries in, wouldn't start. Click, click. And I knew Amy was in town down at Walmart, so I called her. "Well, Dad, I'm at home. I'm just unloading my groceries." I thought, well, I can find somebody here to give me a jump. And I tried a couple more times, and for some unknown reason, I pulled it down into neutral, and it fired right up. It's weird. I don't know why. I don't care why. It worked. And I kind of got a little more basic then. Instead of saying, "Thanks for starting my car, Lord," I said, "Thanks for this car. Thanks for transportation. Thank you that I have stores I could go to." And of course, I had just done some study on some of the destitute people that are fleeing Libya and scrounging all the money they can get from whatever source. No, I mean, we don't know about all those statistics about all the people that get killed. They know. And they're willing to take the risk. This is one of the ways that I know what to preach about. Relating relevant things to God, thinking spiritual thoughts. Whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him, even if you're just taking a shower. Am I only a God nearby, declares the Lord, and not a God far away? Can anyone hide in secret places that I cannot see him, declares the Lord? Do I not fill heaven and earth, declares the Lord? He is omnipresent, and his Holy Spirit lives in us. My admonition to you tonight is learn to see the Lord. Hebrews 11:27 is about Moses. Of course, Hebrews 11 is a faith chapter. By faith, by faith, by faith. Verse 27, by faith, Moses persevered because he saw him who is invisible. How do you do that? What tells us how we do that? By faith. Now, I've got other ways I think up sermons and studies that I do, but this is pretty prominent in my life. Not near as prominent as it ought to be. Think about God. This evening, if anyone here is in need of anything we could provide you with in this church, whether it's prayer or baptism or whatever your need might be, we invite you to come forward now and let us know how we can help as we stand and sing.